You and I, along with everyone listening to this right now, have a direct, undeniable stake in the education system. Um, it is the invisible architecture of our
Oh,
society.
absolutely. Okay.
Whether you are currently navigating it as a student yourself, whether you're a parent trying to guide a child through its complexities, or even if you are just simply a taxpayer, quietly funding the entire apparatus from the sidelines, the way we transfer knowledge fundamentally shapes the reality we all have to live in.
It does. It dictates the future economy, the culture, everything.
Right. Yet, if you take a step back and look at our public discourse, we rarely question the foundational mechanics of that system. I mean, we argue endlessly about the curriculum. We argue about funding levels, right, and district borders. But we almost never stop to ask if the structural incentives themselves, the very engines driving the behavior of teachers, students, and institutions, are fundamentally misaligned with reality.
We treat the structure as if it's a law of physics.
Exactly. But today, we are going to explore a framework that asks exactly that. For this deep dive, we are examining the output of the 14th University Workshop, led by Professor Voshinshenk. We'll be looking at a comprehensive presentation document and an audio recording from that session.
And the mission of our discussion today is to unpack Professor Ink's radical, highly detailed proposal to completely re-engineer the educational system from the ground up. And I want to be clear right from the start. This is not a series of minor administrative adjustments.
No, not at all.
We are not talking about tweaking a syllabus or, just changing a standardized test. What we are looking at is a total departure from traditional bureaucratic educational models. The professor is proposing a system driven entirely by direct economic incentives, unyielding market forces, and highly calibrated negative feedback loops.
The objective is singular, really.
It is. The objective is to align the financial success of the educator perfectly with the long-term economic success of the student in the real world.
To understand how sweeping this reform is, I think we have to start by unpacking the first core premise of the professor's argument. He questions the absolute most basic assumption we have about public schools. He asks a deceptively simple question, which is education actually free?
Right.
We are deeply accustomed to the concept of public education being a guaranteed, cost-free public good. We walk into a building, we sit at a desk, and we learn. But the reality is that education is never truly free.
No, the money has to come from somewhere.
Exactly. Currently, it is the collective taxpayers who shoulder the immense burden of paying for the teachers' salaries. The heating of these massive buildings, the laboratory equipment, the ongoing maintenance, the administrative infrastructure, it all adds up.
It adds up significantly.
The sources outline that the total cost to educate a single citizen in this system, carrying them from the first day of primary school straight through to the end of a university degree, averages around 34,000 euros.
That's a massive investment per citizen.
It is. And if we break that down into its components, we are looking at roughly 13,500 euros just for primary school, another 7,500 for secondary school, and about 13,000 for university.
And the way the professor categorizes the injustice of this current funding model is incredibly revealing. He argues that having taxpayers unconditionally fund this education is not only inherently unjust, but it actually increases social inequality.
Which feels counterintuitive to how we normally talk about public schooling.
It does, but to understand why he makes that claim, we have to look at the different ideological frameworks surrounding education. For instance, the socialist perspective generally views education as a fundamental human right that simply must be universally funded by the state, regardless of the cost or the outcome.
Right, it's just a baseline provision.
Exactly. The conservative perspective, on the other hand, often views education merely as a heavy societal cost. It's viewed as a line item on a national budget that needs to be minimized or cut whenever possible. But the professor aligns much closer to the ordo-liberal perspective.
Which posits that education is fundamentally an investment.
Yes. It is an investment of time by the individual student, it's an investment of support by the family, and it's a massive financial investment by the state. And like any investment, it is expected to yield a substantial return.
And the problem with the current model, as the sources lay out, is that the costs are entirely socialized, but the returns are often privatized.
Precisely.
When the system is free at the point of use, people without children or people whose children do not have the academic inclination or desire to attend university are heavily subsidizing the higher education of those who do.
They are paying for someone else's specialized training.
Right. Furthermore, we know that parents with substantial financial means inevitably supplement this free public education anyway. They hire private tutors, they pay for extracurricular enrichment, they buy homes in better-funded school districts.
Which immediately skews the outcomes.
Completely. The wealthy leverage the free baseline and add their own capital to guarantee their children secure the best spots in universities, deepening the very inequality the public system was supposed to erase in the first place.
But the injustice doesn't stop at domestic inequality. The workshop highlights a massive macroeconomic consequence to this socialized model, which is the phenomenon of the brain drain.
This is where the sheer arithmetic of the current system becomes devastating.
It really is. Consider the numbers. Currently, an estimated 60,000 individuals emigrate from the state every single year. Let us trace the path of just one of those individuals under the current paradigm. A citizen utilizes the state-funded education system from primary school all the way through a specialized university degree.
Meaning the state invests that full 34,000 euros into their human capital.
Exactly. And then the day after they receive their diploma, they pack their bags and emigrate to work in a foreign country.
They just leave.
They leave. The state has essentially acted as a free training facility for another nation's workforce. The specific financial loss of this dynamic, the investment in human capital that immediately leaves the domestic tax base, costs the state roughly 1.2 billion euros a year.
1.2 billion euros simply walking across the border year after year. It's a massive economic hemorrhage. Just to put this in perspective for you listening, the standard allocation for education across all levels is about 5% of the state's entire budget consumption.
It's a huge slice of the pie.
It is. And for an individual working a standard 40-year career, they spend roughly the first 2 years of their working life entirely paying off the tax burden of their own education. When that educated individual leaves before paying into the system, the remaining taxpayers, the people who stayed, the people who perhaps didn't even go to university, are left holding that communal debt.
They are paying for a doctor who is now practicing in another country.
Right. So to fix this, Professor Schenk proposes a radical restructuring of how we pay for school. Under his new system, education remains unpaid while a student is studying. There's no upfront tuition fee. There is no paywall that would lock out a brilliant student from an impoverished background.
That's a crucial distinction. It's not about making students pay out of pocket on day one.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
However, the education is fundamentally no longer a free gift from the state. Instead, every single student takes on a state-backed commercial loan.
Let us examine the mechanics of that loan because it shifts the entire psychological relationship a student has with their school. It means their education is now a highly tracked, personalized investment. They study without paying a single euro out of pocket. But once they graduate, once they enter the workforce and begin generating an income, they begin paying back that specific loan through their personal tax account.
It becomes a direct, trackable obligation.
Exactly. Now, it is worth noting that kindergarten and basic health insurance remain a collective socialized cost. The professor categorizes those as basic reproduction and fundamental security for the society. But primary, secondary, and university education become an individualized debt.
And the state acts as the ultimate guarantor for this commercial loan, right?
Yes, which means the issuing bank is completely secure. If the individual is genuinely unable to work due to disability, or if they tragically pass away before the debt is paid, the state absorbs the remainder. The debt is specifically not inherited by their grieving family.
But this brings us to the most critical mechanism of the loan, which is the strict emigration clause. This is the patch for that 1.2 billion euro leak we were just talking about, because the state is only the guarantor for citizens who remain in the country and actively contribute to the domestic tax base.
That is the linchpin of the whole economic model.
It is. The moment an individual decides to emigrate and take their state-funded skills to a foreign market, the state instantly removes its guarantee. The commercial bank then holds the individual directly responsible. You take your educational debt with you, and you owe the remaining balance globally.
And banks, as the professor points out, have the robust international infrastructure required to collect debt anywhere on Earth. They will find you.
It is a profound shift in risk allocation. It takes the investment risk off the shoulders of the collective taxpayer, the factory worker, the bus driver, the person who never went to college, and places it squarely onto the shoulders of the individual who received the tangible, lifelong benefit of the education.
It's pure accountability.
Yeah, if you use the state's resources to drastically increase your market value, you owe the state that investment back, regardless of whether you choose to generate your income in your hometown or in another country entirely.
And the price of this education isn't just an arbitrary number pulled from thin air. It is meticulously recalibrated to reflect economic reality. The total cost of education up to a university degree is calculated to equal roughly 3 average annual tax contributions.
And the breakdown is highly specific in the sources.
It is. For the lower grades of primary school, the cost to the student is calculated as a 5-month average tax contribution. For the higher grades of primary school, it becomes a 7-month average of the tax contributions specifically of those who graduated from that same school.
That's fascinating, tying it to the specific school's alumni.
Right. Secondary school is a 9-month average, and university is calculated using the European Credit Transfer and Accumulation System, the ECTS. Every 20 credits a student takes equates to a 1-month average annual tax contribution of a graduate from that specific university program.
This mechanism is brilliant because it ensures that the cost of the education is inextricably linked to the economic reality of the people who actually complete it. It takes the abstraction of school funding and anchors it to concrete, verifiable tax revenue.
It creates a closed economic loop.
By doing this, it completely eradicates the conservative critique that education is merely a sunk cost draining the treasury. At the same time, it preserves the core socialist requirement that education remains universally accessible to everyone, regardless of what is in their parents' bank account on the first day of class. It takes the neoliberal concept of education as a tradable commodity, but structures it through a state-guaranteed mechanism to ensure equity of access.
But that creates a massive blind spot, doesn't it?
It does. Because if my future tax bill is tied directly to the education I am receiving, I am the one taking all the risk. I am the one taking on the debt.
Right.
How do I know the education I am buying is actually worth it? If I'm paying for this later, I want guarantees that my teachers are actually equipping me for the modern economy.
And that is where the professor introduces this terrifyingly elegant negative feedback loop for teachers. We have to look at how educators are currently compensated.
Okay.
Right now, a teacher's salary is largely determined by fixed pay grades, by their years of seniority, and by generic administrative titles. Whether a teacher is a generational talent who transforms the minds of their students, or whether they are simply counting down the minutes until the bell rings while reading from a 10-year-old textbook, their financial compensation is roughly identical.
The current system rewards endurance,
Yeah.
not efficacy, just surviving in the bureaucracy.
Exactly. Professor Ink proposes demolishing that model entirely. He suggests tying the literal livelihood of the educator directly to the future economic success of the student.
This is where it gets really radical.
In this new paradigm, a teacher's salary is no longer static. It is directly mathematically determined by the future average salary of their graduating students. The logic here is unyielding and purely market-driven. If you, as an educator, provide tangible market-tested value to your students, meaning you teach them critical thinking, adaptability, and complex problem-solving that employers are desperate to pay a premium for, your students will enter the real world and command high wages.
Because they actually have valuable skills.
Yes. And because your students earn high wages, you, the teacher, receive a higher salary. You take a cut of the value you created. Conversely, if you fail your students, if you phone it in, if you fail to develop their capacities, they will secure poor incomes. Consequently, your salary will plummet.
You are directly compensated for the value you add to the human capital of the nation. But we have to look at the timeline of how this is calculated, because you obviously can't just judge a teacher by what a student earns the day after they graduate. The system is meticulously designed to measure actual career trajectory.
That's a vital detail.
Yeah. When a student graduates and secures their first job, the first 2 years of their employment are completely excluded from the teacher's salary calculation. And the reasoning is very grounded. The first 2 years of anyone's career are highly volatile. A student might get a high-paying job purely because of nepotism or a family connection, or, on the flip side, a brilliant student might take a low-paying internship or a risky startup role just to get their foot in the door.
It's just noise at that point.
Right. The first 24 months are not an accurate reflection of the foundational skills the teacher instilled.
Precisely. The system waits for the noise to clear. The calculation only begins in the 3rd year of the student's employment, where it accounts for 10% of the metric's total weight. In year 4, it increases to 20%. The peak weight of the metric hits right at year 5, accounting for a massive 30% of the calculation.
Year 5 is the crucible.
It is. The economic philosophy driving this timeline is that by the 5th year of a person's career, the initial advantages of a wealthy family network or the disadvantages of a slow, stumbling start have largely washed out. By year 5, An employee is no longer being paid for their potential. They are being compensated based on their actual demonstrated competence, their ability to learn and adapt on the job, and the bedrock skills instilled by their education.
And after year 5, the weight slowly tapers off. It drops to 20% in year 6 and eventually scales all the way down to 2% by year 10. The logic there is that as a worker progresses deeper into their career, their ongoing on-the-job training and professional experience begin to vastly outweigh whatever they learned sitting in a classroom a decade prior.
But naturally, anytime you introduce a high-stakes financial metric into a bureaucratic system, you invite manipulation.
Right, people will try to game it.
Of course. If a teacher knows that their future ability to pay their mortgage depends on the grades they give today, because higher-graded students factor more heavily into the teacher's average payout. Human nature dictates that a teacher might simply hand out easy A's to everyone. They would artificially inflate the grades to maximize their own future return.
Right, if I'm a teacher and my bonus depends on my top students, why wouldn't I just declare that everyone is a top student? But the professor anticipates this exact vulnerability and introduces a fascinating mathematical safeguard. First, we have to throw out the concept of whole number grades. A student doesn't just get a B+ or a 3 or a 9. Grades are calculated to 2 decimal places. A student might receive a 3.17 or a 4.9 or an 8.76.
That level of precision prevents the rounding up that teachers currently use to mask true performance.
It does. But the true, unbreakable safeguard is the normalization of the class average. The system legally mandates that the average grade of an entire class for any given subject must equal a fixed, unchangeable mathematical baseline. In primary and secondary schools, that mandatory average is exactly 3.5. At the university level, the mandatory average is exactly 8.0.
It forces a distribution.
Exactly. Therefore, a teacher is mathematically prohibited from giving everyone a perfect score. If they identify a truly exceptional student and want to give them a 4.99, they must mathematically balance that out by giving other students in that same room significantly lower grades to ensure the collective class average remains perfectly anchored at 3.5.
Let's walk through a scenario of a teacher trying to game this, because it illustrates how airtight the incentive structure is. Imagine a teacher decides to play favorites. They give artificially high grades to a mediocre student, maybe the child of a local politician, and to balance the math, they give artificially low grades to a brilliant but quiet student. What happens?
They shoot themselves in the foot.
Exactly. That teacher is actively sabotaging their own future bank account, because that mediocre student with the inflated grade will go out into the unforgiving workforce, fail to secure a high salary, and drag down the heavily weighted portion of the teacher's average. Meanwhile, the brilliant student, whom the teacher graded poorly, will likely succeed and earn a massive salary, but their high wages won't count as much toward the teacher's bonus because of the artificially low grade the teacher assigned them.
The teacher is financially cornered into being flawlessly, brutally accurate in their assessment of every single student's true potential.
And it goes even deeper for primary and secondary school educators. The calculation utilizes what is called a modified average grade. This tracks the student as they move to the next level of education. If a primary school teacher gives a student a mediocre grade, perhaps underestimating their potential, but that student goes on to excel and receive top marks in a rigorous secondary school, the primary school teacher's initial assessment is mathematically corrected in their favor.
It's a self-correcting system over time.
It is. The system continuously cross-references a student's performance against their peers from other schools. To achieve this, it requires a permanent, highly functional alumni tracking database. This would be managed by the state's statistical offices, pulling real-time tax data via national identification numbers.
Which ensures total anonymity and mathematical precision.
Yes. The teacher never knows exactly what a specific former student is earning. They simply receive an aggregated, anonymized payout based on the collective truth of the tax registry.
Now, anyone listening to this who understands how markets work is probably screaming at their device right now, because this brings us to a highly predictable, glaring societal problem.
The inequality issue.
Right. If my pay as a teacher is inextricably tied to how much money my students make in the future, human nature dictates exactly what I'm going to do. I am going to abandon poor, rural, or marginalized areas immediately. I'm going to pack my bags and fight tooth and nail to get a job at an elite school in the wealthiest suburb I can find.
Because the baseline is already so high there.
Exactly. I want a classroom filled with the children of doctors, lawyers, and CEOs, because those kids already possess massive socioeconomic advantages. They have the networks, the capital, and the safety nets that practically guarantee they will secure high-paying jobs, regardless of how well I teach them. If we implement this purely as described, we are creating a system primed to hyper-accelerate inequality and abandon the vulnerable.
That is the exact devastating critique one would level at a purely neoliberal application of this idea. If you just unleash raw capitalism on the classroom, the rich get the best teachers and the poor get whoever is left. But the professor is acutely aware of this and introduces a profound countermeasure.
Special Education Fund.
Yes, the Special Education Fund. This mechanism essentially acts as a systemic, state-sanctioned Robin Hood protocol. But to understand how this fund actually redistributes wealth and talent, we first have to understand the proposed ownership structure of the schools themselves. Educational institutions would no longer be purely state-owned bureaucracies, nor would they be purely private corporations driven by external shareholders.
They become a hybrid.
They would operate on a mixed ownership model, 30% owned by the state and up to 70% owned privately. But crucially, that 70% is privately owned by the employees of the institution, not by outside corporate investors.
This is a massive shift in how we view public servants. The current private institutions would be immediately nationalized to 30%, with the previous owners compensated based on the institution's annual revenue. And from there, the ownership is continuously reprivatized to the workforce. Every single year, 1.78% of the institution's ownership is transferred directly to the employees, distributed proportionately based on their salaries.
Meaning the teachers, the administrators, and the staff literally own the school over time.
They receive direct dividends from the school's profit. But let us look at the state's 30% ownership stake. When the school generates a profit, the state takes 70% of its profit share and pours it directly into this massive, centralized pool, the Special Education Fund.
And this fund is weaponized to achieve profound social equity through a highly specific multiplier mechanic. The fund distributes massive financial bonuses to schools, specifically targeting primary and secondary schools based on a ratio of improvement. This ratio compares the student's expected future salary against their parents' current salary.
Let's create a scenario to see how this changes a teacher's career calculus, because the math here is fascinating. Imagine teacher A and teacher B. Teacher A lands a job in a pristine, wealthy district. The parents are executives. The expected future salary of those students is quite high, but the ratio of improvement is incredibly low.
The system expects those students to do well.
Right. It is not a remarkable feat of pedagogy to maintain the status quo of generational wealth. Therefore, Teacher A's bonus from the Special Education Fund is effectively zero. They make a stable living, but they aren't getting rich.
Now look at Teacher B. Teacher B is highly competent, ambitious, and wants to maximize their lifetime earnings. They look at the math and realize the real money isn't in the suburbs. They choose to go to a heavily marginalized area. The professor uses the example of a Roma settlement in the workshop. Or we could imagine a deeply underdeveloped rural town suffering from industrial collapse.
Areas with deep systemic poverty.
Yes. In these areas, the parents' current salaries are extremely low, perhaps non-existent or purely reliant on basic social support. If Teacher B goes into that environment and actually manages to educate those students, equipping them with the skills to enter the formal economy, go to university, and significantly raise their future earning potential above the poverty line their parents experienced, the ratio explodes. The mathematical improvement is massive.
Because that ratio is so high, Teacher B receives an enormous, life-changing multiplier bonus from the Special Education Fund. This is the genius of the countermeasure. The architects of this system are effectively using raw, ruthless, profit-seeking capitalist incentives to drive the absolute best talent toward the areas of greatest social need.
It's an alignment of selfish and selfless goals.
Exactly. A teacher looking to build wealth will quickly realize that the greatest financial return is not in marginally polishing the children of the elite, but in fundamentally elevating the children of the impoverished. It aligns the selfish human desire for wealth with the desperate societal need for uplift. You turn your most ambitious teachers into highly paid social workers. The greater the socioeconomic deficit a teacher overcomes, the richer the state makes them.
It forces us to rethink the fundamental motivations of public service. We rely heavily on altruism right now. We hope good teachers will go to tough schools simply because it is the right thing to do. This system says, don't rely on altruism. Rely on economics. Pay them what the societal impact is actually worth.
So, we have established how the individual student is incentivized by the debt and how the individual teacher is incentivized by the salary multiplier. But how do we organize the institutions themselves? How do we decide which schools are even allowed to exist? This requires moving our discussion up to the institutional level, examining how universities and academic programs are permitted to operate and how they are judged by the public. Professor Inkling levies a completely blistering critique against our current system of accreditation.
The critique is indeed harsh, and it targets the core bureaucracy of higher education. The professor characterizes the current accreditation system not as a valid measure of educational quality, but as a corrupt gatekeeping monopoly.
A bureaucratic stranglehold.
It is a system where obscure committees hand out permissions to operate based on easily manipulated input-based criteria. For example, a university might receive accreditation simply based on the sheer number of PhD holders they employ on their faculty, regardless of whether those specific professors have any actual ability to teach or whether their curriculum is relevant to the modern world. It's purely optical.
Purely optical. The professor goes so far as to reference a historical incident, and we will keep the individuals anonymous to focus on the systemic flaw where actual physical violence was utilized to secure accreditation for a controversial institution.
Physical violence over a bureaucratic stamp of approval. It just highlights the immense financial power of being the gatekeeper.
Exactly. When a bureaucratic body holds the sole key to a lucrative market like higher education, corruption, coercion, and ultimately stagnation are the inevitable results. The current accreditation system is described as artificial, a Procrustean bed that forces every single institution into the exact same rigid administrative shape. This harms everyone. It stifles the most capable, innovative institutions that want to experiment, and it provides unwarranted cover for the least capable institutions that just want to collect tuition. So the proposed solution is to take a sledgehammer to the entire concept. In this new system, traditional accreditation simply ceases to exist. It is completely abolished. It is replaced by a strict, entirely transparent public ranking algorithm.
Market decides.
The market decides. The very concept of needing permission to operate from a committee is gone. Any educational program founded by anyone can open its doors tomorrow and begin accepting students immediately. However, every single newly founded program starts at the absolute bottom of this ruthless public ranking list. There is no more hiding behind a generic accredited stamp on a brochure. You are ranked against every other program in your field nationwide, and that specific rank is visible to every prospective student, every parent, and every future employer.
And the algorithm driving this ranking is breathtaking in its pragmatism. 50% fully, half of a university program's entire public ranking is based strictly on the average salary of its graduates.
That is a massive weighting.
It is the ultimate validation of an educational institution in this model. It's not the size of its library, not the ivy on its historic buildings, and certainly not the theoretical prestige of its tenured faculty. The only metric that truly matters is the open market's willingness to pay the human beings who learn there. The remaining 50% of the algorithm is divided among other practical, measurable metrics. 20% is awarded for the competence and recognized global awards of the teaching staff. 15% is allocated for the quality of the physical space and the laboratory equipment. And the final 15% measures the institution's financial success in collaborating with the outside market, meaning applied innovation, intellectual property, and active industry partnerships.
And the math behind the ranking is transparent. If there are 30 engineering programs in the country being compared, the program that ranks first in a category gets 30 points, the second gets 29, all the way down to the last program, which gets a single point. These points are then multiplied by the weighted percentages, the massive 50% for salary, the 20% for competence, and so on to formulate the final undeniable public rank. But here's where it stops being just a marketing tool and becomes hardwired into the reality of the state. This ranking is directly tied to government hiring policy.
This is a critical pivot in the proposal. Currently, as the professor notes, many students pursue generic degrees simply to secure a sinecure, a safe, secure, relatively undemanding job in the civil service or state administration. The state often requires just a generic university diploma to get in the door, regardless of whether it came from a rigorous top-tier university or a degree mill that barely functions. The new system demolishes this pathway. To get a top high-level position in the government, let's say you want to be an assistant minister or a senior policy director, an applicant must have graduated from a program ranked in the top 2% of all programs in that field.
Top 2%, that's incredibly exclusive.
It is designed to be. For lower-level appointed positions, the requirement drops to the top 10, 20, or 35%. But for any employment in the state civil service whatsoever, from top to bottom, the applicant must have graduated from a program ranked in the top 50%.
Think about the cultural shockwave that would send through the civil service. It means the state will no longer accept mediocre graduates from bottom-tier programs just because they managed to acquire a piece of paper. If you decide to go to a newly opened program that is currently ranked at the bottom, or if you attend a legacy program that has coasted on its 20th century reputation while its modern graduates fail to secure good salaries, you are mathematically locked out of government employment.
The state protects itself from bad educational products.
The open market determines the validity of the diploma, and the state uses that market data to ruthlessly filter its own workforce. Furthermore, a university diploma only holds its full value for 5 years.
Yes, the introduction of the working diploma concept. Because technology, methodology, and human knowledge evolve so rapidly now, the professor argues that a degree earned 20 years ago simply does not represent current competence. After 5 years, your full diploma degrades into a working diploma. To reinstate its full value and maintain your professional standing, the university must offer, and you, the graduate, must complete supplemental courses equivalent to 20 ECTS credits.
It legally forces a culture of continuous, lifelong learning. It ensures that the workforce remains constantly updated on the delta between what they learned half a decade ago and what is currently known to be true today.
Now, if we're going to subject the students and the institutions to this level of relentless performance tracking, it inevitably means we have to reevaluate the professors themselves. We have to look at the entire title system.
Which is sacred ground in academia.
It is. In the current academic world, achieving a high title, like full professor, often functions as a lifetime guarantee of employment. It is the ultimate academic safety net, a shield against the pressures of the outside world. But under this new framework, those lifetime guarantees are entirely stripped away. Academic titles are no longer a permanent shield against underperformance.
To achieve this level of accountability, the system completely separates scientific titles from teaching titles.
Currently, they are disastrously tangled together. You might have someone who is a brilliant, world-class researcher. They make incredible discoveries in the lab. But they are a terrible communicator. They despise students, and they mumble through their lectures. Yet they have a high teaching title simply because of their massive research output.
Or conversely, you might have a magnificent lecturer who can inspire a room of hundreds, but who hasn't published a novel scientific finding in a decade.
Exactly. The new system recognizes that these are two entirely distinct professional skill sets. A person could be a full professor in teaching, reflecting their mastery of pedagogy, but merely a research assistant in science. Or they could be a scientific advisor, the highest possible research rank, but only an assistant with a doctorate when they step into the classroom. The evaluations are entirely independent of one another.
And the evaluation process for teaching quality introduces a level of scrutiny that is almost unheard of in modern academia. During a professor's election period, which occurs every 5 years to determine if they maintain their rank, they are subjected to an unannounced quality control audit. A professional 3-camera crew can randomly drop into a lecture without a single moment of prior warning to record a standard 45-minute class. They record the professor's delivery, they record the presentation materials, they record the whiteboard, and crucially, they record the faces and body language of the students to gauge their actual engagement and comprehension.
It is highly invasive.
Let's just pause there, because as someone who has stood in front of a room, that sounds absolutely terrifying. A surprise 3-camera crew. That sounds less like peer review and more like a reality TV ambush. The anxiety that would induce in a faculty lounge must be off the charts.
It sounds brutal, absolutely. But you have to look at the baseline it is replacing. The current baseline is often zero oversight once tenure is achieved. A professor can read from yellowed notes for 20 years without anyone checking if the students are actually learning. This footage from the camera crew is not reviewed by the professor's friends or local faculty colleagues over coffee. It is submitted to a centralized, independent state commission, drawn from the highest-ranking teachers nationwide, who are paid per candidate to brutally audit the teaching quality.
They're looking for genuine pedagogy.
They assess whether the professor is effectively communicating complex ideas, whether they are incorporating the absolute latest global scientific results from the past 10 years into their syllabus, and whether they are genuinely educating rather than merely reciting outdated facts.
And the consequences are real. If a professor fails to meet the criteria for advancement in 2 consecutive election periods, they are permanently frozen in their current title. They can never advance further. And while their employment remains relatively stable as long as they perform their basic duties, they absolutely can be terminated if they consistently fail to deliver quality teaching. The precariousness of the adjunct or the young assistant is removed. If you are hired, you have a stable job. But the guarantee of perpetual advancement and immunity without merit is destroyed.
The standards for scientific prestige undergo an equally radical transformation. The professor argues that the state does not extract taxes from its citizens to fund science merely to generate obscure theoretical papers that sit unread in expensive academic journals. The state funds science for two reasons: to drive tangible economic development and to advance culture. Therefore, the old system of simply counting publications on the Science Citation Index is deemed entirely insufficient.
Right.
The new scoring formula for scientific advancement is incredibly demanding, and it is demanding because it is multiplicative rather than additive.
This is where we need to translate the math into reality. Under the old system, if you published a paper, you got points. If you published 10 papers, you got 10 points. You just added them up. This new system introduces categories: publications, protection of intellectual property like patents, and commercialization of those results, meaning you actually brought it to market. But instead of adding your scores in those categories, you multiply them.
Think of it as a series of multipliers. In the old system, a brilliant paper secured your career. In this new system, if you publish a brilliant paper, you have a strong base score. But if you fail to patent that idea, your score in the patent category is essentially a 0. If you fail to commercialize it, your commercialization score is a 0. And what happens when you multiply your brilliant publication score by 0?
It flatlines.
It flatlines. The system mathematically forces the academic out of the ivory tower. If your idea doesn't hit the real market, your academic prestige score barely moves.
Let's walk through the exact comparison the professor uses because it perfectly illustrates the brutality of this new standard. Imagine two researchers. Researcher 1 is the classic elite academic theorist. They only publish deeply theoretical papers in the top-tier journals of the world. They get the absolute maximum score for publications. But they find the business world distasteful. They never patent their findings and they never commercialize them. They multiply their massive publication score by 0 in IP and 0 in commercialization. Their final score is an 8.
Now contrast that with Researcher 2. Researcher 2 is a pragmatist. They publish in weak, low-tier journals. Academically, they are not highly respected. However, they managed to secure a minimal national patent for a small, practical finding, and crucially, they managed to commercialize this finding, perhaps partnering with a local manufacturing firm. Because they engaged in all three categories, publication, patenting, and commercialization, their small scores multiply against each other. The math works out so that Researcher 2, who published practically nothing of high academic note, achieves a score of slutting, which is almost identical to the top-tier theoretical academic who scored an 8.
And you could have a Researcher 3 who publishes absolutely nothing at all, 0 papers, but secures a strong patent and commercializes it, and they would also score a 7. This multiplicative dynamic is explicitly designed to aggressively force academics to engage with the real economy. If you only publish, you stagnate. But if you combine publication with intellectual property protection and actual market commercialization, which is measured strictly by the tax paid on those commercial revenues, because, as the professor notes, revenue numbers can be faked in a press release, but no one fakes paying taxes to the government, your score multiplies exponentially.
The system demands that intellectual output translates into economic productivity. If you do not patent and commercialize, you do not have a monopoly on the knowledge, you don't create jobs, and you do not generate profit for the state that funded your research. The incentives are brutally clear.
This relentless systemic drive for efficiency, applicability, and real-world value inevitably trickles down from the grand economic formulas to the daily, minute-by-minute experience of the students themselves. This brings us to the final major segment of the workshop, where Professor Njegomir interacts with the audience regarding daily curriculum changes. And to be clear, our sources include the audio of this Q&A, and we will refer to the participants generically, focusing our attention on the structural changes Professor Njegomir is proposing. The core of this curriculum redesign revolves around dismantling the fragmented, chaotic reality of the current school day.
Currently, a student's day is a deeply fractured experience. Think about how jarring it is. A student might spend 45 minutes diving into a complex mathematical equation. Just as they start to grasp it, a bell rings. They have to slam that book shut, run down a hallway, and immediately transition their brain to analyzing historical causes of a war for 45 minutes. Then a bell rings again, and they are in physical education. Then a bell rings, and they are doing chemistry.
It's exhausting just describing it.
The professor argues that this constant, rapid context switching prevents deep, meaningful learning. The cognitive load of constantly shifting gears is exhausting and inefficient. The proposed solution is a pedagogical shift to something called block teaching.
Block teaching is a strategy of total immersion. Instead of jumping frantically between 5 different subjects every single day, a class will dedicate itself entirely to one specialized subject like physics, chemistry, or biology for 4, 6, or even 8 weeks straight. During this block, they don't just sit and listen to isolated hourly lectures. They integrate theory with practice. They do the lab work in the morning, discuss the theory in the afternoon, complete the homework collaboratively, and finally take the exam, all in one continuous, unbroken flow of concentration.
Once that subject is fully mastered and tested, they move on to the next block. The sources note that this has actually been tested in certain engineering programs with spectacular results. It produces graduates who are highly sought after by industry because they have learned how to deeply internalize complex systems over a sustained period, rather than just memorizing fragmented facts to survive a Friday quiz.
And this block teaching extends far beyond the 4 walls of the traditional classroom. The professor envisions integrating the city's resources, specifically museums, directly into the core curriculum. Museums would no longer be places for passive, occasional field trips where kids wander around looking at plaques. They would become active, specialized learning environments equipped with dedicated laboratories. An entire class might spend a full day every single semester in a specific museum, be it biology, history, or geography, working directly with the curators.
Those curators effectively act as specialized adjunct instructors. The environment itself becomes the classroom, contextualizing the block of study in a tangible, physical way.
But perhaps the most profound change to the weekly schedule is the introduction of what the professor calls integrative Fridays. From Monday to Thursday, students are locked in, deeply focused on their core block subjects. But on Friday, the regular academic classes completely halt. The entire architecture and social hierarchy of the school shifts. Students are no longer artificially segregated by their age or their grade level. They are randomly and deliberately mixed. You might walk into a room and see a first grader sitting next to a fourth grader, or a high school freshman collaborating directly with a senior.
The purpose of Integrative Fridays is to break that artificial isolation of the age-segregated classroom and to foster essential social, empathetic, and democratic skills. The older students are tasked with actively mentoring the younger ones. And this isn't just a casual buddy system. Their own academic evaluations are tied to the success of their mentees. It forces the older students to learn how to impart knowledge, how to be patient, how to communicate complex ideas, simply a skill that is entirely distinct from merely acquiring knowledge for a test.
The activities on these Fridays are highly structured around interaction. They involve academic competitions, collaborative workshops, and crucially, explicit education in the messy mechanics of democracy.
The sources detail that this involves learning the practical mechanics of elections, understanding the necessity of tolerance in a diverse society, and engaging in highly structured, respectful debates about diverse ideological and religious systems. The professor explicitly states that students should not be segregated into different religious or cultural classes, separating the Orthodox, the Catholic, or the Islamic students into their own silos. Rather, everyone must learn about all systems together because they must all live together in a pluralistic society.
They actively practice the explicit, difficult skill of putting themselves in someone else's shoes. They analyze different teaching materials, sometimes reading texts in foreign languages, comparing those foreign perspectives to their own domestic textbooks. The goal is to develop critical, comparative thinking, rather than blind nationalism or dogmatic acceptance.
This is where we see a direct connection to a fascinating phenomenon the professor observed during the COVID-19 pandemic. An audience member during the audio Q&A notes the incredible logistical and pedagogical difficulty of executing these integrative Fridays. And the professor agrees, but he notes that the COVID generation of students, the ones who were forced out of the classroom and had to learn autonomously at home, actually developed superior skills in synthesizing information.
Because they didn't have a teacher spoon-feeding them, they learned to pull from multiple sources, videos, AI, various online text forums, rather than just memorizing a single state-issued textbook. Integrated Fridays aim to institutionalize that self-directed, multifaceted synthesis. However, as another listener acutely points out during the audio Q&A, executing a curriculum this dynamic, a curriculum that requires such high-level facilitation of ideological debates and cross-generational mentoring, demands an incredibly competent teaching force.
And that listener's observation brings this entire deep dive full circle. You cannot legally mandate integrative Fridays, you cannot execute immersive block teaching, and you certainly cannot have teachers who are intellectually capable of orchestrating complex, respectful ideological debates between a senior and a freshman if you are paying those teachers a substandard bureaucratic wage.
It's impossible.
The only way to attract the absolute highest caliber of intellect into the teaching profession, the kind of people who usually become corporate lawyers or software engineers, is to offer a compensation package that rivals the private sector. And the only sustainable, scalable way to fund that level of elite compensation, according to this proposal, is to tie their pay directly to the economic value they generate in their students over the long term. The progressive curriculum redesign is entirely dependent on the ruthless financial engine of the negative feedback loop.
It is a closed loop of incentive and outcome. You can't have the beautiful collaborative Fridays without the brutal, market-driven accountability of the 5-year salary metric.
Precisely. The system is a complete interlocking mechanism. You cannot adopt the pedagogical reforms without the economic reforms, because the economic reforms are what guarantee the quality and sustainability of the pedagogy.
So we have just unpacked a massively complex, deeply interconnected blueprint for hacking the educational system. We have looked at replacing unconditional taxpayer funding with state-guaranteed individual commercial loans that vanish if you emigrate. We have explored the radical, terrifying mechanic of tying a teacher's literal livelihood directly to their students' future incomes, complete with a 5-year peak metric and strict mathematical grade normalization to prevent cheating.
We examined the Robin Hood Special Education Fund that weaponizes raw profit incentives to drive top-tier teachers out of the wealthy suburbs and into the poorest neighborhoods.
We discussed the destruction of the accreditation monopoly in favor of a brutal, transparent public ranking algorithm inextricably tied to government hiring. We looked at the end-of-lifetime tenure, the 3-camera audits, and the multiplicative formula forcing academics to commercialize their research or perish. And finally, we saw how all of this extreme economic efficiency funds a redesigned, immersive curriculum featuring block teaching and integrated Fridays.
It is a staggering, provocative reimagining of what a state institution can be when it is subjected to the unrelenting pressures of market logic, individual accountability, and precise performance metrics.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. As we wrap up this deep dive, we ask you to reflect on your own life and your own trajectory. Think about the specific teachers you had when you were sitting in those classrooms. How would your education have changed? How would your current career trajectory, your current income have changed? If your teachers' literal livelihoods, their ability to pay their mortgages and feed their families, had depended directly on the salary you are earning right now, would they have pushed you harder? Would they have identified your hidden talents earlier? Would they have abandoned those outdated textbooks and rote memorization to teach you the practical, adaptable skills the market actually demands?
It is a deeply compelling counterfactual to imagine, but it also leaves us with a necessary, grounded, and intensely philosophical question to ponder as we step away from the blueprint. If we successfully engineer an educational system that perfectly optimizes for financial return on investment, where every lesson, every grade, and every professor is precisely calibrated to maximize the future tax revenue and market salary of the student, what happens to the intrinsic value of human knowledge that does not immediately translate to a high market wage? What becomes of pure philosophy, of abstract poetry, of theoretical art, or history pursued purely for the sake of understanding the human condition? Does hacking the system for peak economic efficiency risk turning the profound, unquantifiable nature of human curiosity into nothing more than a highly optimized, purely commercial commodity?
That is the profound tension at the heart of this optimal system. We want to thank you for joining us on this exhaustive, unhurried deep dive into the source material. Until next time.